This week, my coworker Chase Snyder joins me to discuss the latest threats to security and network appliances, including new vulnerabilities and threat actor misbehavior on Avanti and Fortinet platforms, and some actions you probably need to take now if you have that stuff. So stay tuned. Below the Surface coming up next. Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 44, being recorded on Thursday, January 16th, 2024. I'm your host, Paul Asadoorian. I'd like to introduce Chase Snyder, my coworker and product marketing. No, you're not product marketing manager. You're, what is your title, Chase?
Director of Product Marketing. Close
That's
enough.
what I meant to
You're
say.
at Eclipsium.
That's what I was trying to say.
Nailed it. It doesn't matter.
I was just trying to mute my phone. You think I've done enough of these where I remember to mute my phone?
Oh, no. It keeps it organic.
It keeps it organic. That's it. Well, Chase, it's good to have you here on the show. If you don't mind, for our audience, maybe sharing a little bit about yourself and your journey that brought you here.
Yeah, 100%. Thanks, Paul. It's so awesome to be on the podcast here with you. Longtime listener, first time guest of Paul Asadoorian podcasts. Yeah, I just joined Eclipsium a couple months ago, but I've spent about the last decade doing product marketing for cybersecurity startups, largely in the network security space, and have been tracking the increasing number of vulnerabilities and attacks targeting routers and switches and these devices on the inside of environments, inside of enterprises, inside of critical infrastructure that are increasingly proving themselves to be an enormous source of risk. And so that's something that we're going to talk about today. But yeah, I started out in the network performance monitoring space, which quickly pivoted into the network detection and response space. And I've spent some time working on operational technology security for stuff like manufacturing providers and oil and gas pipelines. And we all saw how wild it can get when that type of critical infrastructure comes under attack. And as we see more and more disclosures of advanced persistent threats, potentially state-sponsored, intentionally targeting critical infrastructure and getting in there, laying low, living off the land, it becomes more and more urgent to turn our gaze inwards at the technology inside of these critical infrastructure environments and say, what is in here that could potentially be housing and concealing a major threat, potentially from a geopolitical adversary or, a contentious relationship
with the typhoon there, right?
Yeah, the typhoon thing has been huge. So yeah, that's who I am. It's great to be here, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Chase. Just before we get into it, a quick announcement for our listeners. You can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo, all that, at eclipsium.com/go. So I guess we'll start with Avanti because that's first in our notes. And, we're not picking on any vendors, right? Because we ourselves are also a vendor. So we all live in glass houses. There's a lot of companies that employ a lot of people that produce hardware and software, and no one's perfect, right? We all have some kind of security vulnerability in our collective hardware and software that we're bringing to market. I just like to preface it with that because I don't want to seem like we're picking on anyone. But we're just reading what has been released recently. We're going to talk about Avanti and Fortinet. Avanti has released 2 new vulnerabilities recently. I have the CVE number somewhere, but if you're an Avanti customer, hopefully you've been notified of that, so you can apply patches to your Connect Secure is the current name for the Avanti product line. It used to be called Pulse Secure, right? There was multiple acquisitions that led up to it. Watchtower Labs has done a great job of writing up the exploit and details on the exploit. And Chase, I don't know if you read their quote, but I'll kind of summarize it. Like, basically they made an update to their post. It's like, everyone says that we're picking on vendors and we're writing exploits and pointing out vulnerabilities. And the security community, I think, is behind what they're saying is like, kind of get over it. Like, this is a problem we all have to deal with together. And also, there was the a very specific language about the types of vulnerabilities and exposures that we're discovering or are becoming public on not just Avanti's platform, but several different platforms. In my mind, fall in the category, Chase, of we know how to fix these issues, right? I mean, we ourselves have pointed out in the DNA sequencer there were vulnerabilities in the UEFI platform system. So, and though we know how to fix those vulnerabilities, we know how to configure. There are facilities for doing that in UEFI, and the DNA sequencer is just one example. There's also vulnerabilities in the software stack that we know how to write a web interface that is more resilient to command injection and authentication bypass vulnerabilities than we find in this sector of network and security appliances. Again, I want to say I'm picking on them, but it's a very factual statement. You can go back to all the advisories. You can see a very clear trend of vulnerability classifications that are primarily authentication bypass and command execution vulnerabilities. And these lead to bad things happening, but they're avoidable. We debated that, last night in my other podcast, but they are somewhat avoidable. And what's your take on that aspect?
I am reminded of a quote from one of my favorite like sci-fi cyberpunk authors, William Gibson, where he said the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I feel like you
Yeah.
can say that about secure software. There's
Yeah.
a lot of
Yes.
ways that the software supply chain is incredibly complex. An enormous percentage of the code that exists, even in enterprise products, was not written inside that product. There's the open source sort of situation, classic
Mm-hmm.
XKCD
Yep.
comic about how all of internet infrastructure is supported by some guy in Nebraska who's been working for free since 2003.
Yep.
It's like there are these things that we as an overall industry know how to fix, and it just hasn't been done yet in a lot of important places. But when you're an enormous global company selling to the Fortune 500 and all the major governments, I don't think it's a matter of the security not being, just accidentally not having made it there yet. It's
Mm-hmm.
to some degree a matter of accountability. And, these are cost driven, profit driven organizations that if there's not pressure from the buyer or pressure from a regulator, if there's not some sort of cost being imposed for doing something the way it's always been done, even if that's known to be insecure, then they wouldn't do it. And so when these kinds of disclosures happen, they do get patched. It would be awesome if they got patched sooner than that. But before that, they're prioritizing. And I would guess that the processes for prioritizing what to patch and what to fix and what to even look at to see whether it's secure, I would guess the process isn't super crisp or updated. And also that there's more priorities than they can physically get to. I think a
Yeah,
lot of
they need a
alert
driver.
fatigue.
It's
Yeah, go ahead.
interesting, Chase. You remind me of the Microsoft and the famous Bill Gates memo in their pivot to focus on software security and doing that really, really well. And people will still pick on Microsoft, but they do a great job addressing the vulnerabilities. Also, on the security appliance side, we do see a lot of patches coming out, which is a positive thing. We do see them on a regular patch cadence, fixing vulnerabilities. The the difference is Microsoft and Apple and Google are obviously much larger companies than some of the ones that are producing network and security appliances. I don't know, maybe Cisco would not be in that category, but uh, the commonality between Microsoft, Apple, and Google is this tremendous effort to have more reliable software, to have software that doesn't have flaws when it gets shipped. And all three companies have done amazing work in making sure that it's super hard for an adversary to exploit their software, right? Some examples, if you look at Chrome, what Google's doing with Chrome, well, there's a lot of controversy about whether Google's going to keep Chrome and all that stuff. And I've been following that. That's like a quick aside. But in Chrome, like I've read research articles how Google has commissioned a research team to look at new technologies that are able to squash whole classes of memory corruption vulnerabilities. Great. We see the Apple zero-click vulnerability that was a chain of multiple exploits together, along with some of the most innovative research I think I've ever seen in exploit development. That's super hard. So they set the bar really high. And I think the contrast to network and security appliances is when I look at what's coming out, right? Isn't like a feeling. This is a factual opinion, right? When you look at the bug classes and types of vulnerabilities that we're seeing, it's much easier for an adversary to exploit them. And that's one thing that I believe needs to change, right? We need to start raising the bar of security in these appliances that are meant to protect our enterprises from the get-go as well.
Yeah, 100%. The idea that something is inside of your environment and therefore it's somehow acceptable for it to have a lower bar for security than a web browser or your phone or whatever, it's just being proven ineffective. You can't allow for that lower security bar for something that's, rack mounted in the data center than you do for
Yeah.
endpoints, and typically that's just sort of how it is right now, is that stuff is not held up to the same standard. And if it's not being held to that standard, the companies are not going to invest in achieving that standard the way
Yeah.
that the consumer companies are.
And I've seen this type of exploit that was patched recently in Avanti, and I believe the memory corruption vulnerability is in the web server code itself. And I've seen this on IoT devices, embedded systems, and appliances many, many times in the past 20 years. And the code quality of these smaller web servers, right? They want a really lean web server to deliver a special purpose web application. And these leaner web servers are typically ridden with these types of bounds checking memory corruption flaws. And that's super frustrating because I started observing these more than 20 years ago, and we still have them today. Obviously, we're going to have bugs, we're going to have vulnerabilities, but these are specific classes of things that we could fix, right? We could use fuzzing, we could use a better SDLC process. Back when I was hosting some of the AppSec and enterprise related podcasts on the topics of security, we talked at length about how you build a process that can produce more resilient software. And this was 5+ years ago that I was talking, to folks who were making solutions, folks who were implementing solutions. And I was like, wow, we have great tools available and processes available to produce better software, but not everyone's doing it. And then we
Yeah.
see in this space, especially, that code quality, in my opinion, is very poor and could be better. And I agree, the incentives are backwards, Chase. I think you're spot on with the incentive structure being like there has to be an incentive. Customers have to demand it. That was the Microsoft classic example where I believe that customers demanded Microsoft, hey, you need to be better, right? And it led to things such as the firewall being enabled by default on Microsoft Windows systems. If you bring that to security appliances, the vendors tell you, do not expose the web interface to the internet. Now, Microsoft said that too. They were like, hey, don't put a Windows system directly on the internet with ports, 139 and 445 exposed because you're gonna get owned. But now we're in 2025. We've solved that problem, but we have the very similar problem with these network and security appliances where you spend a lot of money for these devices and they go, well, you know what, you shouldn't expose those to the internet. And so now we have these devices that aren't resilient enough to have that exposed to the internet. And that doesn't sit well with me because these devices are on the edge. They're on the internet. I mean, you have to do something in the configuration to expose the web management interface, but I think that's backwards,
Yeah. It's like, I heard you like firewall, so you probably need to get a firewall for your firewall. Make sure your firewall is
right?
not on the internet and getting pwned.
Right. VPN appliances are a different animal, right? Because the VPN does have to have things exposed, and oftentimes that is the pathway that leads to exploitation, right? So there we just need better code quality and more resilient software. The management interfaces are a different animal. I made the analogy to Kia. I don't know if you're familiar with the Kia boys.
Oh yeah.
right? And it's very simple. Like Kia's like, well, we decided to produce an insecure vehicle that doesn't have an immobilizer. And their advice, like, literally says, well, don't park in places where people might steal it. And if you have a garage, make sure you park it in the garage. That's the same thing as network appliance vendors saying there's a web management interface, but just you can't expose it to the internet. It's like the same thing, right?
Yeah. There's really, I mean, that sort of passing the buck or that sort of
Mm,
transferring risk. There's three things you can do with risk, right? You can accept it, you can mitigate it, or you can transfer it. And there's
right.
been, radical discussion about cyber insurance, which is fundamentally a way of transferring risk to the point where for certain things, you just can't get insurance anymore. Like ransomware is bad enough that you just can't really get cyber insurance that'll
Oh,
cover
you
it.
can't get you can get insurance for a Kia vehicle, but my neighbor happens to sell insurance, and she's like, I was getting these ridiculous quotes. I'm like, you know why? She's like, no, I was wondering why I told the whole Kia boy story. And she's like, oh, that makes perfect sense now. It's
Yeah.
super high insurance rates.
They transfer the risk to the end user, and that's sort
Yeah.
of in the risk accepting scenario. When you buy a network appliance from a very reputable vendor, you might not think as much about the risk that you are accepting. But if
Right.
you install that appliance in your environment and then it turns out to be the path by which an adversary achieves initial
Hmm.
intrusion or establishes persistence or just sort of a lily pad on their lateral movement journey, it's like you have to think about how much the appliance mitigated your risk, especially if it's something like a firewall that's supposed to mitigate risk, versus how much new risk it introduced. And it might be a
Right.
wash. So the risk calculus gets a lot more challenging with
Hmm.
these kinds of appliances where you don't have as much visibility and there's this inherent trust that has existed over the decades that these vendors have been around that is eroding. I think the trust is eroding and the willingness to just accept the risk or ignore the risk is going away with these serial disclosures.
Right. And it's difficult waters to navigate when you're trying to fix these issues. Like, let's say you have VPN appliances, maybe it's Avanti, CVE 2025 0282 and 0283 are the two new vulnerabilities that were released. Mandiant says they have identified zero-day exploitation of the 2025 0282 in the wild beginning mid-December. And these patches were just released like this week or last week, right? So you're already behind the curve. And you have to know that you have the vulnerable versions, and then you have to go apply the remediations. In this case, applying the patch, which way, way back in the day, I managed VPN appliances, and I can tell you, I like to think that things are better now. Like the challenges I had 15 years ago or whatever, don't like it's an easier time today. But when I get to talking to people, it's not because applying patches to VPN appliances is a headache because you have to bring sometimes you have to bring the appliance down, which means people lose their VPN connectivity. So there's downtime associated with it. These are not easy devices to patch.
Yeah. We talk a lot about the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities catalog here, right? You just had an episode
Hmm.
with celebrating the 25th anniversary
Right.
of uh of the catalog and the percentage of well, there's a couple angles. One, there's like 200,000 CVEs, right? Not all on the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, but there's an enormous number of CVEs, right? And then the ones on known exploited vulnerabilities, you talk about the difficulty of patching. I think it was in the Verizon DBIR report from last year that showed the kind of curve of like how long it goes from disclosure to patch in organizations for known exploited vulnerabilities. And
Hmm.
it's like half of them are not patched yet after 50 days. And there's still some percentage of them that have not yet been patched after 180 days. And when you're on that kind of a timeline where an adversary can start exploiting that thing really quickly, we don't have to get into AI or we can, but it's getting possible to write exploit code really fast.
Hmm.
And if the ability to find out about those new vulnerabilities and patch them isn't keeping up with the ability to exploit them, then yeah, we're going to start seeing more exploits against these kinds of vulnerabilities.
Right, right. Avanti does recommend that customers can run the integrity checker tool. I've not read a lot about that tool. I know some of these types of tools from vendors. I'm not sure if it was Avanti, but in order to run this kind of like forensic analysis tool that comes from the vendor, you have to take down the appliance, right? It has to be out of service while that runs. I'm not certain if that's the case with Avanti's integrity checker tool, but I know we've talked about that in the past, and I think it was a different vendor that said that. So, of course, we're
Yeah.
furiously putting into our own product uh, tooling that does the same thing and better, right? That looks for not just vulnerabilities, but indicators of compromise and firmware integrity. If you want a sneak peek into, what our engineering and research teams are doing, that is one of the top priorities, especially as these things become public. We're looking at adding detections, and not just detections. That's a poor word for it, right? Giving customers visibility into their appliances to say, am I vulnerable? Has someone compromised it? And is the firmware a known good image? We do that for a number of different platforms.
Yeah, 100%. Eclipsium is working really hard on being able to provide that visibility into an area that's kind of typically a blind spot for
Yeah.
organizations, right? It's like
Oh yeah. What is
you've
that? That
got,
one slide we have, right? Where you build all of the stuff for like you get Windows, and by default Windows from Microsoft is not in the most secure state. So maybe you do some hardening, and then you're adding on an EDR or some kind of antivirus, or maybe just using Defender on that platform, right? And then maybe you're putting something else on there to manage patches for it. Um, and you've got all these kind of add-on things that you're putting on Windows. Largely, right? That doesn't exist for network and security appliances. What's the equivalent of an EDR for my Cisco Fortinet F5 Avanti Fortinet? Like the list goes on. What's the equivalent? There really isn't. Other than manually performing forensics or using the vendor, if it exists, the vendor specified tool for doing incident response and forensics on that platform, which ends up being a very manual process. Most shops don't just have one vendor that I mentioned from that list, right? If you throw Cisco in the mix, most people I talk to are like, yeah, like I use Cisco for this, I use Palo Alto for that, or whatever. So now you've got all these individual tools, and it becomes a laborious task, and you might miss something. You're going to spend time doing that. So
yeah, you got to have an internal expert in Cisco DNA Center that's gone ahead and doing it. And then that same thing for each of the other
right,
ones. And I think the reason, check me if I'm overstepping on this, but part of the reason that there's not sort of a standardized EDR for network appliances as you're talking about is that it's kind of hard to do. There's not as much standardization across the
yeah,
product category itself. When you're talking about user endpoints, Windows or Mac or Linux things. Well, we don't have to bring Linux into this, but um,
yeah.
there's
Well, Linux is. I know where you're going though. Like when we had the CrowdStrike incident, it sparked a debate: should Microsoft allow kernel access to
yeah,
Windows? And to your point, when we go over to network and security appliances, that's the case. We don't have that granular level of visibility into the kernel, into the system to be able to put additional security software on there. And then you're right, every single platform is different. Um, and so we have that challenge, similar to Windows, where we have better visibility because Microsoft allows you to interface with the kernel, and sit and put a driver on the system that has that level of visibility to both detect and prevent threats. But we don't have that. So guess where attackers are going, right? Guess where a lot of the materials you've been working on, Chase, right, point to attackers are gravitating towards network and security appliances. One big reason is most organizations have a true lack of visibility into these platforms. So let me go compromise that rather than trying to get in on a Windows system where I might be met with some resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's highly visible that the attackers are going where the low hanging fruit is for them. CISA put out their report on the most, not just the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, but the most exploited ones. They published the report in 2024, but I think it was the data from 2023, and more than half of them affected network infrastructure. And some of those, will include the idea of like log4j. Okay, that was a huge,
Yeah.
huge vulnerability. Lots of different types of devices and infrastructure are vulnerable to that. But there are also really specific ones to specific vulnerabilities in the most exploited, known exploited vulnerabilities that are against, Cisco, Citrix type of like widely
Right.
deployed infrastructure products that, yeah, when there's been a couple of decades of really hardcore cybersecurity development and research into protecting endpoints and quite a bit less emphasis on those other things. It's like, yeah, we've done a great job. Like kudos to the cybersecurity industry for the level
Yeah.
of protection that there is on endpoints. But
Now,
there's
a lot
another
of
playing field now.
but a lot of malware for Windows systems that people discover or see observe in the wild, a lot of it's not like that, not that advanced, right? I've talked to folks that work for big MSPs that have visibility into a lot of different breaches and different strains of malware. And like for the most part, they're like the majority of it is not advanced. When we look at the malware that's infecting network and security appliances, Mandiant has Spawn Ant, Spawn Mole, and Spawn Snail, which is an SSH backdoor, as well as Dry Hook and Phase Jam. So we have wonderful names that we can easily recognize for all of this malware. But if you dig into the techniques that were used on the Linux system, they're kind of easy to detect. It's nothing super. I mean, there are always exceptions to that statement, but for the most part, the Linux malware, especially the ones that are affecting these appliances, it's not super advanced because it didn't have to
Yeah.
be because there's no EDR to jump around, right? On the Windows side, we see malware that is spinning up VMs and living off the land with drivers and other built-in facilities in Windows like PowerShell and SSH and using that to try and evade detection. When we go to this security appliances or network devices, it's not that. I'm like, oh, if we only had some basic detect, which is what we're building, right? I mean, that's why I have insights into all that is because engineering is working every day to produce detections for these devices and discovering this mostly Linux. I mean, a lot of these things are Linux or Linux like under the covers. But again, it's kind of a lockdown ecosystem. I
Yeah.
will say, Sophos specific RIM is an interesting in this context in that we did observe some more advanced malware, right? There was malware that was infecting the firmware and infecting it in such a way that if you applied a firmware upgrade, it would reinfect it. I was like, none of it was like necessarily new. It was based on security research that already existed, but I don't know that I've seen anything that advanced like that in the wild, at least not very often. And then, of course, they went into the UEFI level and tried to bypass security protections like Intel Boot Guard, right? So that was some more advanced stuff happening that but the reason they uncovered that is we talked about this on the show before, but I still think it's amazing. Sophos produced and deployed to customers a kernel level implant to give them visibility. And that's, props to Sophos for doing that. What I would like to see is customers being given that level of visibility. However it plays out, I want customers to have that level of visibility. I want us to have that level of visibility, quite frankly, like self-servingly and selfishly. I want that too because I want to be able to detect these threats for the customers. I don't want anyone. I think the assumption is that no one's going to look at these devices, right? No one's gonna no one's gonna touch them. There's it's a box with a logo, so it's under the covers. No one should have access to under the covers and just like trust us. It's a secure platform when it's really not, and that's okay. That's okay. Like I said, no one should be producing hardware and software and have the Oracle mindset of well, there's no vulnerabilities here. No attacker could do that. Like that's not it's not what I'm saying. You don't have to have that. Like I get it. You should want to produce the most secure and resilient software and platforms as possible. But let's not brush it under the rug. And you know what I mean? That's not helping anyone. Produce it as we did the best we could, but we're also going to give you some facilities to double check things and monitor as you go. That's where we need to be. And I won't fault anyone for that. I won't fault anyone that produces an SBOM that has vulnerable software. That's okay. Like there's a lot of software that if you looked at an SBOM has vulnerable software in it. And they're worried about legal ramifications. And again, we've had the SBOM discussion, but I think it's okay. I think we'd rather have the visibility and like make a promise we're not going to name and shame if you do that. If you give more visibility, and with that visibility we find more vulnerabilities, we shouldn't name and shame that, right?
Yeah, in a weird way, it's kind of a trust signal. It's like when you look online for product reviews or restaurant reviews, something is all 5 stars, kind of suspicious. You're like, that's fake. Those are fake reviews. But if there's some, 4 or 3, if there's some more authentic seeming worse reviews, you're like, okay, that it indicates that there's a level of transparency or there's a level of reality to it that you can trust it a little bit more. And I think, yeah, kudos to Sophos for the amount of transparency that they showed, not only in providing that kernel level implant, but in their write up of the whole Pacific Rim situation was really, what a wild ride. But
yeah,
you mentioned all the different spawn snail, and we've got like the Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon and everything. This extended cinematic universe of APTs and their various weaponry that they're using. But I thought you made a really great point that I want to touch on again, which is that they're not exclusively using extremely advanced or novel malware or 0 days. There might be, like you mentioned, Pacific Rim as kind of an interesting, unique instance in that they did use some very sophisticated malware. And I think there's kind of a stereotype that a lot of companies, enterprises, they're not going to be attacked by an APT. It's like, we're not a big enough target for that kind of thing. And the notion that you have to be some sort of a big target to get attacked by an APT, maybe, there's state-sponsored APTs are only going to go after a certain type of organization, but the vulnerabilities that they're using are totally commoditized and just like automated. And the speed, and I think you and I have talked about doing some research and trying to figure this out, but the speed
like
at which
and how often, right? What's out there and how often. And it's interesting too. We didn't necessarily have that debate when before Microsoft turned on the firewall by default, and we were like, don't expose 445 and 139 to the internet because you're gonna get popped. No one said, well, no one's gonna want to compromise me. No one's, maybe people did, but I think more so we begged Microsoft to help fix this problem because it was really bad, right? But when we go to the network and security appliance side, I want to see that same kind of driver, right? The same kind of like, we don't feel we need to apply more security to our network and security device because we're not going to be targeted by nation states, right? Use the analogy. Well, we didn't want to put Windows systems on the internet, or maybe we did, but that was a really bad idea. And no one was saying, well, I'm going to put it on the internet anyway, and nation states aren't going to target me. No, you weren't targeted. You were just automatically owned with something that could cause bad things. And that's what's happening now. If you put a vulnerable one of these appliances and expose it to the internet, you're going to get compromised in a pretty short amount of time. And it may not be a nation state. It may be a nation state. Maybe they don't care necessarily about you, but they have goals and they're going to use that to achieve their goals.
Yeah, 100%.
Like, I want to go to Fortinet because
so get into it.
Fortinet's PSAR, if I filter for just advisories released in 2025, I get a total of 34. Some of the articles say there was 15 or so that were published recently, but if I go all the way back, starting on January 14th, is when they made a big release, starting with, well, now it's interesting. So this is I had this conversation with Alec and Lisa about the CVE. So the advisory from FortiGuard was published on January 14th, 2025. The CVE is CVE 2022-23439. There's reasons why that happened. We talked about them on the last podcast, right? So that's kind of frustrating. Likely because Fortinet has I don't know why it went all the way back to 2022 necessarily, but the other ones are 2024 because Fortinet, I'm just going to venture a guess. I'm not going to fact check myself, but I'm guessing they're a CNA and are issuing CVEs for their own product, would be the likely, and they get pre-allocated those CVEs, right? So we've got 34, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing. They're fixing their software. That's great, right? But some of these vulnerabilities were involved with some pretty significant attacks and malicious activity and threat actor campaigns, however you want to say it, out there. It's super hard to track, like, which ones I need to pay most attention to. Like, I kind of get lost because there's 34, and like some of these were being abused by attackers. So if you're out, you gotta sort through these. And I think you had some other interesting things that happened recently too with the Fortinet stuff.
Yeah, I noticed an article from Kevin Beaumont, aka Gossie the
Mm-hmm.
dog, about
Right.
another Fortinet vulnerability. I think it was a 0-day that was from back in 2022 that did get patched, but just today, I think it was. Yeah. Yep, I'm seeing 20 hours ago on the article that I'm reading that's published. A big bunch of firewall configs, including like all firewall rules and all configuration information about a bunch of FortiGate, about 15,000 unique instances of FortiGate firewalls got published. So even if you had already patched that, even if you were really fast to have patched CVE 2022-40684, if you haven't updated your firewall configs or credentials on that, there's still a lot of information out there that could be a real problem for you. And so it's like this sort of rolling disclosures, like there's no end to it. There's sort of this compounding nature of this risk where a CVE comes out, maybe you patch it, maybe you don't, or maybe you patch it immediately, maybe it takes you a while. But then if you got compromised in between the time when it came out and you patched it, you might not find out about that right away. And the consequences of that compromise that happened in that sort of window of vulnerability might
Right.
come back at you a long time later. And so there's a whole world of sort of internal risk that's really hard to measure and manage that stems from these vulnerabilities and the whole stew of when they get disclosed, when the patch comes out, and then your ability as an enterprise to respond to it or to deal with it.
Yeah, I
And
think it
I
was
don't know what should people do.
Arctic Wolf tracked this campaign, started noticing things, I think last December in 2024. Ultimately, that would be CVE 2024-55591, which is an authentication bypass using an alternate path or channel vulnerability in FortiOS and FortiProxy. Request the Node.js WebSocket module gains super admin privileges. And so that was part of like a larger campaign that Arctic Wolf has like 3 articles that you should definitely read, especially if you're a Fortinet customer. Go check out like everything that they summarize. I mean, they produced a lot of details about this particular vulnerability, and there's other ones in there too um, that they mention as well. So here's the summary of the campaign. So they noticed vulnerability scanning in November of 2024, more reconnaissance in November, SSL VPN configurations or maybe reconfigurations in December, and then lateral movement later on in December. And they go through all the IOCs are published in there as well. And that is part of the ones that were just recently fixed. Again, super hard to navigate all this stuff. I wish I had a
Yeah.
better
We
better,
talk
more
about alert
guided way.
fatigue, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
that's exactly what it is.
yeah, there's like these layers of alert fatigue. We talk about getting alerts about security incidents or potential things within your environment, but then it's like the industry, your vendors are sending out all these notices that you then have to pay attention to, and the ability to prioritize it. It seems like a primo use case for AI to me.
Yeah,
That to do figure out which elements of this can be effectively parsed and prioritized enough
right.
automatically to bring down the number of things that need actual human intervention down to a manageable level. But it's been an ongoing narrative in the cybersecurity industry for years that there's not enough people to do the amount of work, or that the amount of work that's needed is multiplying far faster than the number of, you know, capable
Yeah,
professionals in the realm. And that's either going
yeah,
to have to be addressed with automation or job training, or reduce the amount of vulnerabilities and alerts that are happening. There's a lot of ways that you can work on addressing this, but if you are on the ground in the trenches right now working on it, what should you do? Like if you're in the shoes of someone who is reading this article and knows they have Fortinet stuff in their environment right now, what do you do, Paul?
Mm. Well, I would definitely pay attention to FGIR 24535. That's a 9.6 CVSS score, CVE 2024 55591. Definitely go read Fortinet's PCERT document on that. It has indicators of compromise that include log entries that you should look for, in addition to IP addresses were found in the logs, as well as admin or local users that were created, and using some more IP addresses. And there's also workarounds in there as well, in addition to obviously patches that are available. So there are workarounds. So Fortnite did a great job of documenting this. But again, as we highlight, like it's super hard to prioritize all of this.
Yeah. Prioritizing just which of these Fortinet items to look
Right.
into, let alone the zillion other priorities that are
Yeah.
absolutely
And
on
it
the
was the
plates of these
it was the
cyber teams.
55591 that was the stuff that you sent me about this was part of the leak.
The one,
No, there was a
yeah,
different one you sent me. So it was Florian Roth,
yeah. Oh,
who's
big
awesome.
fan.
Yeah, but why you should never blindly block IP IOCs from threat reports, because are they being spoofed? And what's interesting, when I go through the IP addresses, it says the following IP addresses were found, mostly found used by attackers in the above logs. 8.8.8.8 and 8.8.4.4 were in there. And those listening may recognize those as Google's DNS, public DNS resolver servers. And so if you're using those and then you block, like Florian's got a point, and now we get evidence to back up Florian's point, you probably should pay attention to that stuff.
Yeah.
Also, 127.0.0.1 is in there as well.
Yeah. That's an area where it's like, that's a, introduces an obstacle to automation. And obviously, your automation wouldn't have to be that smart
Mm-hmm.
to recognize those and say, okay,
Right.
no, we're not going to block Google's DNS resolution. But if you have, relatively unsophisticated automation that's just blanket blocking that stuff, like, he posted this for a reason. It's because some people are doing this, or saying that they're going to do this, or recommending the automatically blocking the IP IOCs from threat reports.
Right.
And it's just not that simple. Nothing about it is that simple. And so we get back to the prioritization challenge and what needs to happen to make what the vendors are publishing consumable and actionable by the people that need to consume and act on it. Because right now,
Mm-hmm.
who knows whether they see the notification, who knows when they see it, or how they prioritize it. Something that I think Lisa said on your episode about the 25th anniversary of CVE was that it's getting more towards the ability for folks to amend CVEs or add additional context and sort
Yeah.
of build up what data is in there. And that sort of crowdsourcing, open sourcing, or just making that data more customizable in a way I think could really make a difference in how it gets consumed and used. Because having this kind of context, having someone be able to add information about how exactly you should act on this or could act on it based on a comment like, yeah, don't go blindly block these IPs in this because it's you're going to end up blocking Google DNS resolution. It's like giving a little bit more context at every stop along the way for that data from the vendor to the end user that has to act on it inside their enterprise environment seems
Yeah.
really valuable.
I think I hate to be like the accident chaser, right? But the advice, closing thoughts and advice for threat teams is you got to pay attention to your network and security appliances. Um, get as much visibility as you can on these devices. Pay attention to all of the vulnerabilities being released and have a great process for patching. Like you're in like defense mode now on these systems because the trend that we've seen for over a year are vulnerabilities being discovered, exploits being written, and threat actors using that in campaigns to compromise many, many organizations in the past year and a half or so, especially. That means you have to pay attention to these platforms. You have to apply security processes to these that include patching, that include monitoring, detection, prevention, patching. The whole thing has to be there. And that's hard, especially if you've got multiple of these platforms. It can be difficult, which is why I like where I work in the product that we make because it helps customers of all of these appliances gain visibility into them and do
Absolutely.
things like firmware integrity. So
Yeah. Any sort of a security control that you would insist on for a user workstation or endpoint in your environment, all signs point to that it's time to start insisting on those same level of
yeah,
controls for your network devices.
for sure. Well, Chase, thank you so much for joining me on this episode. I want to thank everyone for listening and watching. That'll conclude this episode of Below the Surface. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Thanks all.